be talking about Rachmaninoff's fascination with death and how it both impacted his personal life and made its way into his music. We'll be looking at what he himself said about death, for example, in his letters to the poet Marietta Shagagnon, as well as the reminiscences of those around him that show a side of Rachmaninoff that wasn't all doom and gloom as he is often portrayed. We'll also look at some of his works that deal with the themes of life and death, and how they reveal a philosophy that was constantly changing over the course of his life, and that was often marked with fear and despair, but was ultimately one of hope. We will, of course, talk about his many quotations of the Dies Irae, the medieval Latin chant of death, and if you're wondering if that whole video was a setup for this one, yes it was. Content warnings for death, obviously, but also for depression and some potentially unsettling ideas about mortality and existence. But other than that, I'm excited to get into it, so without further ado, I hope you enjoy and thank you for watching. So the origins of Rachmaninoff's fear of death can be traced back to the cultural environment that he grew up in, as well as several traumatic events in his own life. Rachmaninoff was born in Russia in 1873, when throughout much of Europe, there was a shift away from the idealism of the Romantic era and into the disillusion of the modern era. Artists at the time tended to glamorize things like suffering and self-degradation, and this mindset was intensified by social and political upheaval, such as a growing discontent with the Russian imperial government that contributed to the revolutions of 1905 and 1970. Rachmaninoff's personal obsession with death can also be attributed to his personal experiences. As someone who craved emotional attachment and was also very empathetic, he was greatly impacted by the deaths of the people that he cared about. When he was 10, there was a diphtheria epidemic in which Rachmaninoff caught the disease and recovered, but his sister Sophia died. 2 years later, his sister Yelena, who is a very talented singer and had introduced him to Tchaikovsky's music, died of anemia. In 1893, with the death of Tchaikovsky himself, Rachmaninoff lost someone who had been a significant influence on his musical style, as well as an enthusiastic supporter of his work. And as a tribute to Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff wrote his Elegiac Trio No. 2. In 1915, Rachmaninoff attended the composer Scriabin's funeral, which left a lasting impact on him and might have been the inspiration for his funeral march Etude Tableau, Opus 39, No. 7. He also dedicated an entire concert tour to Scriabin's works. At that same funeral, his old counterpoint teacher, Sergei Taneyev, caught a cold and died of pneumonia a few weeks later. And in 1938, there was the death of the opera singer Fyodor Shchelyapin, one of Rachmaninoff's closest friends and greatest inspirations, and this had a noticeable impact on Rachmaninoff's mental and physical health. So Rachmaninoff's preoccupation with death remained and actually increased throughout his life, with the deaths of those around him and as he himself got older. He didn't like to publicly talk about his ideas on death, or any other aspect of his personal life for that matter, but he did reveal some of them in his correspondence. Sometimes this took the form of self-deprecating humor, such as when he wrote, "I take pleasure in deducting the passing days from my life's account," to his secretary. In 1916, he basically went into a panic after reading a book that was centered around death. In fact, afterwards, he said to his poet friend Marietta Shagagnon that it's impossible to live while one knows one must die after all. It seems that what Rachmaninoff feared most about death was the uncertainty of what came after. Again, content warning because this is pretty depressing, but he once told Shagagnon that he couldn't stand the thought of an afterlife because he was already tired of himself and thought it would be better to just stop existing. Another possibility is that he was worried about getting older and thought he was running out of time. Starting from very early on, he would comment that he felt like he was aging and becoming fatigued or forgetful. His friends at the conservatory called him the old man, and when he was a bit older, he said, "In my lifetime, I have not done all that I could have done, and this realization will not make my remaining days happy," and said he wished he had worked harder when he was younger because now he no longer had the strength to do so. However, despite all this musing on death and a tendency to focus on the negative side of things, Rachmaninoff was not all doom and gloom. I don't mean to understate the impact that his fixation on death as well as his mental illness had on his life and music. But to understand Rachmaninoff's beliefs on death, we need a more complete picture of his personality. Like I mentioned before, Rachmaninoff was a very private person and didn't like to talk about his personal life. Instead, he believed that he could express all that he needed to through his music. And so the general public and his concert audiences saw someone who was very reserved and almost aloof, though his playing was very expressive. The only ones who actually got to see that other side of him were his family and his close friends. And they saw someone who was capable of truly enjoying life. For example, Rachmaninoff was fond of gardening and plants. He loved driving his car and also his speedboat. He loved his kids and grandkids. He had a very wholesome sense of humor and enjoyed pranks. He liked art and poetry. Even more important, despite his depression and his obsession with death, he had a very strong willpower to keep on living. We can see this especially in his later years when his health was declining, but he still insisted on playing concerts. This was partly because he truly loved performing for how much it inspired him, partly because whenever he performed, his physical pains seemed to go away, and also because it was something to keep him occupied and productive, as feelings of languishing or wasting time often worsened his depression. I think another reason is that he didn't want to acknowledge the fact that he was actually getting older at this point, and wanted to prove that he still had the vitality of his younger days. Either way, Rachmaninoff insisted on playing concerts and touring extensively even when he was exhausted and had enough money to retire comfortably. In February of 1943, literally a month before he died, his health had declined to the point that he finally had to cancel the last half of his concert tour. From there, he took a 60-hour train ride back to his home in California to receive medical treatment. Even in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, the whole time he was very worried about missing his daily practice. He was also doing hand exercises so he would be ready to perform again. And a few weeks later, on March 28th, 1943, he died of advanced melanoma. And so the point I'm trying to get across is that Rachmaninoff, as he neared the end of his own life, faced death not with a sense of defeat, but instead with a kind of stubborn defiance. And we can hear this gradual shift of attitude in his music. First in the way that he uses the dies irae to represent death, and also in the pieces that actively address the concept of death. A quick note before we get to the analysis. Usually, Rachmaninoff didn't like to reveal the particular source of inspiration behind his works because he believed that the listener should be able to decide the meaning of each piece for themselves. Two of the pieces we'll be looking at today, the Isle of the Dead and the Bells, are instances where Rachmaninoff did reveal a bit more about the story he wanted to tell, but there is still a lot of room for subjective interpretation. A certain passage might sound peaceful and contented to one person and resigned to another, as an example. With that in mind, on to the analysis, starting off with a key feature of Rachmaninoff's style, his quotations of the dies irae. If you're unfamiliar with the dies irae, basically it's an ancient Latin chant about the biblical day of judgment and the belief that at the end of the world, God will judge all people and decide whether they will go to heaven or hell. The text was rather awe-inspiring and fear-inducing, but also had overtones of hope, justice, and redemption as the speaker prays that they will be saved. In the Middle Ages, the dies irae was often sung at Catholic funeral rites, but beginning around the 1800s, the melody was widely used in non-religious works, and over time it morphed into a symbol of death, fear, the macabre, Satan, etc., and often lost that original hopeful aspect. Rachmaninoff was probably not introduced to the dies irae in its original religious context, as the dies irae has Catholic origins, but Rachmaninoff's family was Orthodox Christian. Instead, he had heard it in the pieces that he conducted or performed, such as Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, which tells the story of an artist hallucinating that he's at his own funeral, and Liszt's Totentanz, which literally means dance of death. And because of the dies irae's association with death and his own fascination with death, Rachmaninoff took note of it and used it in many of his own works, both consciously and subconsciously as a sort of natural mannerism. Another possible reason for why the dies irae shows up in so many of his works is that the melody of the chant moves in very small intervals, which also happen to be a feature of Rachmaninoff's own melodies, so the dies irae fit very conveniently into his own style. Either way, because he had learned about the dies irae in a very casual way, he wasn't actually familiar with the full chant or its origins until late in his career. In 1931, when he asked one of his musicologist friends about it. In his prior works, he had mostly just quoted the first 4 notes of the chant, and often used it in the context of death and or evil, as most composers did. Only in his last 3 works, which were the Paganini Rhapsody, 3rd Symphony, and the Symphonic Dances, which we will look at today, only in those pieces did he have the benefit of the additional knowledge about the dies irae. Now, to see how Rachmaninoff's ideas on death changed throughout his life, we'll be looking at 3 works written at different points in his career, starting off with the Isle of the Dead, which he composed when he was in his mid-30s. This piece is a symphonic poem based on Arnold Boeklin's painting of the same name, in which a ferryman rows a deceased soul across the water to the island. The rower is often thought to be Charon, the ferryman of the dead in Greek mythology. Rachmaninoff had initially only seen the black and white version of the painting and was rather disappointed when he saw the original. He said that had he seen the original first, he might not even have been inspired to write the piece. Rachmaninoff's Isle of the Dead can be divided into 5 sections, that of death, life, and death. The first section features a 5-count ostinato that is usually interpreted to be the ferryman's oars pushing through the water and then up again into the air. It could also represent breathing and how life and death are intertwined. And of course, there is the obligatory quotation of the dies irae. The next section, life, is where the deceased soul recalls happier times on earth. This section is more a product of Rachmaninoff's imagination and isn't based on the painting quite as much. Where the death section is rather low in pitch and sounds rather menacing, now we have more balance between the upper and lower registers. There is an interesting violin melody that climbs up in a rather hopeful way, but ends with another quotation of the dies irae, as if to say that all life must end in death. The third section is another death section and is very similar to the first, except this time the dynamics are much stronger, as if overpowering the fragility of life. The fourth section is again life, but a bit more frantic, as if the person is desperately trying to hold on. However, in the fifth and final section, there is one last struggle between life and death. Death wins, and we end with the 5-count rhythm of the ferryman who has left the deceased soul on the island and is rowing back across the water to pick up the next. And so, in Isle of the Dead, Rachmaninoff's attitude towards death ends in a sort of resignation. There is the conflict between life and death, and sadness at the realization that all human happiness is only temporary, but he comes to accept the inevitability of death. The next piece we'll be looking at is Rachmaninoff's choral symphony, The Bells, which he composed when he was 40. Rachmaninoff loved the sound of bells, which he had heard in the churches that his grandmother used to take him to all throughout his childhood. He associated the sound of bells with tears, which is quite interesting, and in this piece he said that he wanted to set down on paper the bells' lovely tones that seem to express the varying shades of human experience. The source material for the text is Edgar Allan Poe's set of poems called The Bells, which depicts 4 kinds of bells, each associated with a different stage of life. Sleigh bells for birth, wedding bells for marriage, fire bells for mature age, and funeral bells for death. However, the version of the poem that Rachmaninoff used was Constantin Belmont's translation, which is significant because Belmont had taken quite a few liberties with the text. The original poem only mentions death near the very end, while Belmont alludes to death quite a bit. Even in the poem about birth, we have the line universal slumber, and in the final poem he adds the happy thoughts, bitter end to fruitless dreaming, and there is neither rest nor respite save the quiet of the tomb. So it's not really surprising that Rachmaninoff decides to include in every movement quotations of the dies irae, which serve as a reminder of death and as a unifying device, helping to link all 4 movements together. What's interesting about the last movement, the one with funeral bells, is that Rachmaninoff includes a 4-note melody that is based on the church bells of Novgorod where he grew up, and now treats as a favorite memory to look back upon as he fades away into death. And so the piece ends on an unusual slow movement, which Rachmaninoff said was justified because Tchaikovsky's absolutely tragic 6th Symphony also ended on a slow movement, except here here, Rachmaninoff ends the bells in an air of peaceful calm. As in the Isle of the Dead, he accepts death and realizes that all life must come to an end, but this time there is a sense of peace and comfort in remembering back on life. Our last piece for today is the Symphonic Dances, which was Rachmaninoff's last major work, written 3 years before his death. This piece is usually interpreted as Rachmaninoff looking back and reflecting on his own life. He originally titled the 3 movements Noon, Twilight, and Midnight to represent these stages of life, but then scrapped the titles to allow for more freedom of interpretation. Even more interesting is how he makes references to his earlier works, in a way summing up his life in composition. For example, in the first movement of the dances, he quotes his first symphony, a piece that had crashed and burned at its premiere and basically destroyed his self-esteem for 3 years. However, this time he presents the theme in a major key instead of the original minor, as if to say that he had made peace with his first symphony. The theme itself is also based on the Dies Irae, so it could be interpreted as Rachmaninoff's acceptance of death as well. The third and final movement of the Symphonic Dances is probably the most revealing in how Rachmaninoff confronted death at this point in his life. Here we have 2 themes, which people usually call the life theme and the death theme. The death theme is based on the Dies Irae, because of course it is. The life theme is another self-quotation, specifically the 9th movement of the all-night vigil, which tells the biblical story of people rejoicing after Jesus' resurrection. The death and life themes basically spend this movement in an intense back-and-forth conflict. Life is played in the lower strings and then joined by the snare drums in a sort of military march. Death sneaks in its various altered forms until it's eventually stated in a full-out brass fanfare. Finally, in this intense struggle of forces, life is still quoting the all-night vigil, and at the point in the vigil where the choir sings Alleluia, Rachmaninoff writes in the score of the Symphonic Dances, Alleluia. The piece culminates with a series of bombastic chords and an absolutely sublime crash of the tam-tam. And so, it's usually interpreted that Rachmaninoff's last piece is a portrayal of how life triumphs over death. But we need to look a bit closer at this conclusion, as satisfying and redemptive as it is. Because at this point, Rachmaninoff was 60-some years old. He's been surrounded by death all his life. His own health is slowly but surely deteriorating. So it's very unlikely that he believed he would defeat death in the immediate sense of becoming immortal. Instead, we need to look at how he's referring to the biblical resurrection of Jesus, the story that is told in the part of the all-night vigil that he quotes. According to Orthodox Christian belief, and apologies for any inaccuracies because I'm not Orthodox Christian, but according to what I understand of their beliefs, Jesus died on the cross and then was resurrected or literally brought back to life. And since he was able to overcome death, he showed people that they no longer needed to be afraid of it. So the fact of death and dying was still inevitable, but people were no longer bound by their fear of death and could therefore live more fully. And so in these Symphonic Dances, it's as if Rachmaninoff is once again showing that he is okay with the fact that he will eventually die, but different from before when he was so anxious about the uncertainty of the afterlife, he is no longer afraid and is able to look ahead to what comes after. And if we listen again to the Dies Irae fanfare in the last movement, at least to me, it doesn't sound very evil or menacing, and instead rather awe-inspiring and maybe even hopeful. Rachmaninoff knows that he cannot overcome death, but he can overcome the fear of death that has paralyzed him for so long. And because he is no longer afraid to die, he now has the courage to keep on living. And that is how Rachmaninoff confronted death as he neared the end of his own life. And yes, like I said before, a lot of this is up to interpretation. For example, in the Symphonic Dances, does the Dies Irae really represent death? Does it instead represent judgment, etc., etc.? But going back to what Rachmaninoff said about why he didn't like to reveal the program or story behind his pieces, each listener should get to decide what a piece means to them. So these are my interpretations, but others are also valid. Well, at least within reason. But yeah, I guess my favorite part about all this is how Rachmaninoff is usually seen as a dark and sort of depressing depressing composer, which, to be fair, a lot of his works are pretty dark and end in a sort of despairing way. But the fact that he was able to, in the end, find something incredibly hopeful in his journey of trying to understand death, I think that's so powerful. So yeah, I think that's enough for this video. I am going to turn off the camera before this mix of emotions, seasonal allergies, and sunlight turns me into a puddle. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this one. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye.